This is a quick run through of both of my advanced technologies projects throughout this year, explaining their general premises and all of the details for developing them. For Teaching Block 1, I went with the Inclusive Gaming module, creating a game designed for users with visual impairments, and for Teaching Block 2, I went with the Chronic Conditions module, in creating an immersive experience designed to help players with symptoms of depression. I'll be covering both of them in detail, as well as the research that led to the creation of these projects in the first place. Hope you enjoy! For Inclusive Gaming, I wanted to create a game that was able to accommodate for all kinds of visual impairments that could potentially limit a player's ability to enjoy and play a video game. I decided on making a simple game, where enemies would approach the player from different sides and, once they get closer, the player can attack them. There were 5 core elements that I decided to focus on throughout the development of the project. Dyslexia, where I would implement a dyslexic sensitive font for all of the text in-game. Color blindness, where the color scheme of the game would be distinct across all different variants of color blindness. Text-to-speech support, where all menu options and important information would be relayed to the player through an automated voice. Directional audio, where the position of enemies would be conveyed to the player when using headphones. And haptic feedback, where how close an enemy is to the player would be conveyed through controller vibrations of increasing intensity. With this in mind, eventually the idea for the project became a game that, in theory, didn't require the use of sight whatsoever. This is known as an audio game, games designed for players with blindness in mind. One of the best examples of an audio game is A Blind Legend, releasing in 2015. The project was developed using Godot engine, as not only am I very familiar with it, but it offers innate support for both text-to-speech implementation and controller vibrations, which were the 2 aspects of development that I was most worried about implementing. The first priority for the game's inclusive features were its visuals, particularly in implementing both dyslexic-sensitive fonts and a color palette unaffected by different types of color blindness. For the font, I was able to find Open Dyslexic, a free font designed specifically for users with dyslexia. To make it easier for users to read, different areas of letters are emboldened, making it more difficult for letters to blur together and making each individual letter stand out. For the colour palette, a range of colours were tested using filters representing the 4 core types of colour blindness: protanopia, deuteranopia, and tritanopia, affecting the visibility of red, green, and blue respectively, and achromatopsia, categorised by complete colour blindness. Once the colours were tested with these filters, and all still appeared distinct in colour and shade, they were good to go. Initially, the plan was to make these assets toggleable, but this was scrapped, as both the font and colours were still very distinct for able-sighted players. To implement text-to-speech, it first had to be activated using Godot's project settings, where speech functionality was added to the display server class, with voice files already built in. Then, I created an array of different lines that it would speak out, and using the display server function TTS_speak, I could call a line from this array depending on what the player was hovering over. The idea was to give the player guidance on any important information, such as their score at the end, but also to allow them to navigate the menus effectively and knowing whatever state the game is in at all times.
Haptic feedback activated. Audio, text-to-speech, back, main menu. Options, quit.
When an enemy moves towards the player, they trigger a set of collisions, with each trigger playing a sound that gets louder the closer they are to the player in the centre of the screen. All of these collisions are given a variable direction, and depending on whether direction is set to left or right, the sound plays on one of 2 audio buses, with each one panning all the way to either the left or right. This means, depending on the triggers that the enemy makes, sound will only come out of either the left or right side of the user's headphones. Using the same proximity collisions for the directional audio, when an enemy triggers one, it calls the function startJoyVibration on the input class, where, so long as the controller is connected, its vibration can be set. The closer the enemy gets to the player, triggering more proximities, the vibration increases in intensity, letting the player know how close an enemy is through controller feedback alone. So, how does this project hold up as an audio game? Well, not only does the final game include features designed for players with all kinds of visual impairments, but with all the features applied together, all of the necessary information that the player needs to play the game is conveyed without the need to see the screen at all, and the entire game can be played in full without the need for sight whatsoever. While the game itself is relatively simple, only having enemies approach from 2 directions with the limitations of the directional audio system, the features in place allow for a full, uncompromised gameplay experience for players with any problems regarding sight, and meets all of the target goals that I'd set out for it in the design process. For chronic conditions, I wanted to create a game representing symptoms of depression, with the idea that players who may be suffering from depression without any formal diagnosis will be able to play the game and see the same symptoms reflected in themselves. Whilst games that tackle themes of depression do already exist, I wanted to create a game that not only gives help on treating depression, but would also help potential sufferers see the early warning signs. I eventually decided on making a game where the player would control a character suffering from depression living out their daily life, giving the player insight into their current thoughts, with different dialogue points they can interact with and short mini-games to play to vary up gameplay. Research was conducted into different symptoms of depression that would be analysed through dialogue, particularly in feelings of hopelessness, a lack of energy, and a loss of interest and motivation in normal, everyday activities. Additionally, the player would have certain goals that they must complete, signified by different minigames. These goals would include everyday actions such as making food or taking a shower, and once every goal has been completed, the avatar would suffer a panic attack, made more or less difficult by the responses that the player would have given in dialogue throughout the game. This too was developed in Godot Engine, as not only am I familiar with the engine, but offers support for various user-made assets. In particular, the Dialogue Manager by Nathan Hode, which is a tool to simplify both writing and triggering dialogue that I've also used in my dissertation project. Due to the game's relatively simple nature, and its goal to immerse players as much as possible, the assets and visual style of the game had to be both professional and fitting for the project, instead of just relying on basic shapes made in-engine. All of the assets, barring the interaction points and the text, were drawn on paper, designed to give off a rough, untidy feeling. This was a choice inspired by the 2023 game Slay the Princess, a game that similarly uses paper assets to give off a feeling of unease to the player. The use of paper assets also allowed for colour to jump out at the player more prominently. The only colour seen throughout the game is yellow, which has connotations of joy, energy and warmth, and is used as a way of positive reinforcement, appearing both for goals the player must complete and for icons that appear when the player makes a correct dialogue choice. When the player interacts with dialogue, after some time they may be presented with a choice of what the avatar should do in this situation. Depending on the player's answer, a variable called mental health will either increase or decrease, giving feedback for the player's answers and reinforcing positive habits for somebody that may be struggling with depression. This is partly inspired by the 2013 game Depression Quest, where the player similarly controls a character suffering from depression, and they are continually given choices that may positively or negatively affect their mental state. All of the questions and the character's feelings have been influenced by research into depression symptoms and treatments, all of which have been included as links on the title screen. Throughout the game, the player must complete 3 basic minigames. The first involves the player pressing the correct buttons on a microwave, trying to enter the correct combination. The second involves the player trying to rotate the nozzle of a shower, trying to match the specified temperature. And the third involves the player attempting to message a friend online, with each key the player presses corresponding to a set message already outlined by the game. Upon completing these minigames, however, the avatar suffers from a panic attack, where the player must correctly time a button press to proceed. The speed of the reticle is determined by how many positive answers the player has given in dialogue, with the reticle speeding up if the player has answered more negatively, representing a more panicked state of mind. This scene was inspired by a similar scene in the 2018 game Celeste, where the protagonist also undergoes a panic attack. Both this project and Celeste's panic attack scenes involve the player making steady, rhythmic button presses designed to imitate slow breathing techniques, which have been proven to help calm down panic attacks. Despite the game's focus being much more artistic than technical, this project still stands as a useful tool in helping sufferers of depression to understand its symptoms better. Many cases of depression go undiagnosed, and having a tool to further analyse those feelings by immersing players in the life of a character who does suffer could potentially help them recognise the early warning signs and seek out methods of treatment sooner rather than later. While the game may benefit from having more complex gameplay, such as having more varied minigames, it achieved its goal of being immersive through its use of original assets and meets all of the goals for a tool to help sufferers of depression. Overall, both games developed over the course of this module, while very different, have accomplished all of the targets I'd set out for them at the start of their development. My inclusive gaming project allows for complete, unfettered gameplay without the need for sight, and my chronic conditions project's utilisation of assets allows for a much greater sense of immersion, assisting any potential users with depression more prominently. Not only has developing them allowed me to have a much better insight into the tools that Godot Engine has to offer, but they've been very fun to create, and hopefully of use to somebody someday. And that's about it. Thank you very much for watching.